I'm Steve Harper, and here with my buddy Brooks, who's going to introduce himself in a minute. I'm a TV writer, actor, playwright, writing coach. And Brooks and I have been friends for a long time. And we just thought we'd get together and have a conversation about TV and film, TV versus film. And we don't know what this is, but we just figured we'd do it. So here we are.
Yeah, I am Brooks, and I started out making movies with my friends in high school. My buddy was like, "Hey, you want to make a karate movie?" And I was like, "Oh yeah!" And that was it. We made that movie. It was fun. I never looked back. I went to NYU Film School, made a few independent feature films. In the last 15 years, I pivoted mostly to screenwriting, and I also mentor writers and really love every single facet of the game. And I'm a big fan of Steve, so it's really fun for me to have this conversation. So here we are.
I think it's cool that you love every single facet. I don't know if I can say that, but I love the.
Really? What facets of the game do you not like?
I know like writing is rewriting. I don't know that I'm always into it. I don't know that I always want to go back in and roll up my sleeves. And, some of the time it's like, oh, wow, okay, I got to do that again. Really? Because I think there's part of me that always wants to come out of the gate and be like really brilliant and be like, oh, magic done.
Yeah.
So,
have you heard the David Mamet quote where they asked him once, they go, who's the target audience for this piece that you're writing? He goes, every single human being on the planet. Which is great, right? And that's, I get it. There's part of me that absolutely wants to be completely done. But I don't know. I would think, I definitely can relate to that impulse. That there's sometimes it's like, more notes, or I don't want to do it. But to me, that's temporary. And beneath that is so many gifts. And I know you appreciate those gifts.
Yes,
so I would even frame your experience as you do love that facet, but maybe not in that moment. You just need a little more time to love it.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's probably right. Yeah. So the thing that we were talking about a moment ago that is sort of an obsession of mine is, we're in this age where everything is, there's so much streaming content, there's so much content in general, and people are watching movies as well as TV on the same devices, right? Whether it's Netflix or whether it's your computer or whether it's your TV and your streaming apps or whatever. So I believe that there are a lot of people out there. Some of those are professional types on some level, but a lot of them are sort of lay people who kind of think that TV and film are the same. That they're sort of an overlapping, I don't know, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Like one is sort of masquerading as the other, and unless you're really looking at the innards, you don't know what's what.
Well, so yeah, and I would disagree with that general theory that even the layman has a sense of one being episodic and the other being a big adventure. And I think that core distinction is really, to my mind, lends itself to some of the differences of those formats as you get under the hood and figure out how to construct stories for episodic or for one big adventure. No?
Well, no, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think it's tricky though, because one of the things that I'm thinking of, that I sort of want to know, and that, I mean, I sort of know what you mean, but it's kind of like, which one's the big adventure? Because if you're talking about a TV show, you're talking about, say, a 5-season big adventure. As opposed,
Hollywood calling. No, sorry.
As opposed to a 2-hour big adventure, right? So it's really the landscape of that story is actually a bigger one rather than a smaller one.
I would say, I mean, there's different types of episodic, right? To my mind, off the top of my head, for fiction storytelling, there's anthologies, which is just new, that's one adventure per episode.
Sure.
There's the sort of extended mini series or streaming series, right? That's kind of like one 10-hour adventure or 12-hour adventure, right? Like Stranger Things might be. And then there's the typical procedural, which is the detective solves a crime every week. Or with like Friends, it's sort of like there's a mini adventure with the group of people. I didn't really watch Friends much, but with sitcoms, I used to watch tons of TV like in the 80s, like Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley, all that time. That's when actually my sister and I actually had I won't do it now because I'm too embarrassed, but we actually knew the I don't know I don't remember what network it was, but there was a lineup. It was like Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley,
Oh yeah.
Three's Company, two. But like we would sing. There was like
Uh,
when we would sing the lineup. Anyway, but so and those things are those sorts of sort of sitcom type shows were like, oh, there's the people that we know and they have an adventure of the week. But see, to me, that all those things are pretty different, other than the extended long 10-hour adventure. A movie is very much a one big adventure that completes or definitively can't complete at the end, unless it's a European movie, then it's an open ending. But so that's kind of how I see the landscape. Are you seeing it differently than that?
I think there's a little more slicing and dicing that I sort of want to do in that space. There are so many shows today that are serialized, even if they're not, because I like to think of a couple of different things about TV dramas. There's and I've sort of said this to you, and I think there's what I call like the helping show, where somebody's like specifically trying to help somebody. When those are mostly like medical shows and those sorts of things. There's the show that I call like the coping show, which is basically like the serialized kind of navel gazing. What about me, my life, blah blah blah. Right. And then there's everything else, which I think of as like the chasing show. And that's like get the so-and-so, get the perp, get the, all the Law and Orders and CSIs and stuff like that. And then I feel like there are shows, this fourth category, which is some blending of all of those, right? So it's sort of a chasing show, but it's got serialized elements, or it's a helping show, but it's got serialized elements. And in that way, the serialization that we see in all these shows that are happening now make it, to me, the big adventure, and much less the kind of one-off, the sort of Tootsie Roll, break it apart kind of thing that we had like when we were kids, because we are on some level learning about some long arc of a character over 5 seasons, even though they're solving different mysteries or chasing different people along the way.
So that's interesting, because that led me to a thought. And it sounds like you're kind of answering the question of a thought that I kind of had, is that these days, is it more common to have across a season or two some sort of significant protagonist change or main character change? Like Simpsons, the animated series, it's just the family adventures every week, blah, 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 and it could go indefinitely. But are you saying, because right now, let's say there's 550 TV series on now, are you saying a significant number of them not only have adventure of the week, but in addition to that, they have significant protagonist progression at the end of the season?
Well, it's funny because I'm not statistics guy, you are, but I do know for sure that in my own TV writing experience, the shows that I've been working on, every show that I've been working on in the past whatever number of years have serialized elements. So I do think it becomes more popular, like whether you're talking about a superhero show like Stargirl, or whether you're talking about like American Crime is sort of all serialized, at least within a season. Even God Friended Me has serialized elements that carry from one episode to the next and one season to the next. And I think that's the way I've seen showrunners sort of arc out a season. Like, this is the season where the mystery about so-and-so's mother is going to come to light, and the whole season's going to be about that, even though it's about other things. And then we're going to solve the mother thing, and then the season after that's going to be about the dad. I feel like that's what a lot of the shows are doing.
Well, so that leads me to another question. Does it matter, or ultimately is it just what's sort of the impulse, right? If you have certain characters in certain situations, and and the impulse is, wow, you know what? This would be amazing to have it contained in just one episode, or this would be amazing to have different threads that cross different episodes, or this would be amazing to really have it progressively change from, aren't we in a time now, especially with the streamers, where it really is anything goes, and you can, that like before there was with commercials and those sorts of things, there was restrictions that seemed like the box had to be more sort of concrete, whereas now it seems to me like we're in a place where you really do have an opportunity for a lot of sort of experimentation, and even like the lengths of episodes are so variable now because of streaming, right? So is it completely the Wild West? It's probably not completely the Wild West, but it seems to me in that direction, no?
Well, I don't know. I feel like there are certain boxes. There are certain sort of there's certain sort of roads one can go down, and I feel like there are only like, I don't know, 4 or 5 of them, and as opposed to a million of them. So I don't really feel like it's necessarily the Wild West. There are shows, look, there are limited series that last for 3 episodes, 4 episodes, 6 episodes, right? And sort of are built to kind of burn down. Like, to me, the big difference between movies and TV is like in the movie space, you're going to burn it down. Like it's made to burn down. So you can kill everybody by the end. You can burn the family home. You don't need to think about the next episode or the next season or whatever, right? Unless you're obviously, if you're doing some sequel stuff, you got to have some sense of like, well, I want this one character or these 2 characters to survive because there's more story here, right? But essentially, it's like you're gonna end it all. And in the TV world, it's built not to end. Even if it ends soon, everybody's pitching these shows. Like, unless you're famous and you can sort of do whatever you want, everybody's pitching these shows for like a 5 seasons. So you kind of have to go in having some vision of what the 5 seasons could be, even if all of that changes. And I think that's, So I feel like essentially it's like, are we going for a years long story, or are we going for like a very short story? Like, what are we doing? You kind of have to know that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that would come down to the base demand of, what's going to entertain the audience here, what's going to hold their interest. So if and there's a way to hold their interest just by episode to episode, like within an anthology series, that there's really no order it even needs to be in. And then there's a way very much to hold their interest by episode to episode when there's an overarching thread, which is, you're saying most of these shows you've been working on, that's what you guys are very much doing. There's threads that kind of weave through and across episodes. To me, it seems like, you're saying, well, and then even the dynamics, and we've spoken about this previously, that so why 4 or 5 seasons? Well, partly because of the business dynamics, that if they're going to invest a lot of money in a certain project, they're going to get a better return on investment if it happens to be popular enough to justify multiple seasons.
Yes.
As opposed to, just doing one, even if it was great, but not having anywhere to go from there. So I think, to me, there seems like there's these underlying principles of demand, what the audience will show up for, and then of course the supply of the companies creating this content in terms of how do they give the audience what they want and what sort of packages. To me, but I think with those very basic supply or demand mechanisms set, there seems to me more than ever sort of a flexible way to go at it. And to your point about the the helping show or the chasing show or whatever, that's interesting. That actually sounds to me more like the way Blake Snyder would describe his genres. Have you ever read Blake Snyder's Save the Cat book?
Yeah, I have.
So I don't know, are you familiar with the way he thinks about genre and 10 different genres?
I am, to a certain extent. I don't know that I remember it all, and probably have to reread it again.
So for refresher, and for anybody else that's not familiar with it, that sounds similar to kind of how you were breaking down it, at least to my mind. He doesn't think about it in terms of like science fiction or horror or love story, right? He basically takes 10 different categories. I think it's really brilliant. And then takes 3 significant elements that make it different than the other 9. So for example, he'll take monster in what he calls monster in the house, which is generally a horror type movie. But he says what's really important here is 3 qualities. One is you have some sort of contained space. It could be, a house. It could be, in Jaws, it's the small community where the shark can attack. And then there's the house. There's the monster, of course, right? That is a threat to the things in the house. And then there's what's most interesting is the sin, which was most interesting to me, because if you don't have the sin, it doesn't become a basic morality tale. Like if you sin, the monster comes out and eats you. And that core psychological sort of, ethical lesson is what really charges up horror movies. But what he then also did with that structure of those 3 ingredients, House, Sin, and Monster, he said a movie like Fatal Attraction is also in his mind the same thing. Mm-hmm. But in that case, the house was the family unit, the sin was adultery, and then the monster was the adulteress who came back and didn't want to. So to me, that was really instructive and helpful as a feature writer, because it wasn't thinking of genre the way the audience did, which is more about kind of setting and bells and whistles. It was more about, how am I going to develop this thing? Right. And so looping it back to what you're saying, I think I could get my mind around writing a show if I knew it was a helping show, much more so than if it was a sitcom. Because a sitcom is so broad, it doesn't tell me anything.
Right. Well, yeah, I dig all that. It's interesting too, though, because part of the question is a chicken and egg question, right? In a way, if as the creator of whatever the piece is, I get to decide what's the best way to tell this story, right? So that's a creative decision that I get to sort of step into and say to myself, is it a play? Is it a movie? Is it a TV series? Is it a mini series? Like, what is it? Is it a short story? Is it a web series, right? So that's one sort of level of like artistic decision-making. However, we can also look at it as, in the world of television, you're making television for people who want to make television, right? So when you talk about these ideas as whatever's going to serve the audience better, that's a decision that at least in the television world gets made by the television executives, right? Because they're saying, I'm going to buy a TV show and I want it for 5 seasons. You can do whatever you want within that. But they're not saying, like, if it would work better as a movie, no problem. So you're really sort of dealing with the structure of, I've got to make a thing. If I'm in the television world, I've got to make a thing that fits the television world, as opposed to, the blessing of the feature writer who is, especially if he's doing something completely original, he can be like, I'm going to just do what I want to do and serve the people who dig what I want to do. Especially if you're a famous filmmaker, TV is much different than that.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on where you come in on the process, right? I mean, if you're talking about doing spec material, then it's, a spec TV show or you're trying to come up with an idea for a TV show, then getting attachments and moving forward that way. But I mean, I think what you're speaking to is kind of strange to my mind, because again, if we're developing the material, we kind of pick that path. Is it going to be feature? Is it going to be, episodic? Right. And then from that point, then a movie company or whoever that's going to put up the money then comes in and of course they're already positioned to, we make movies, or some companies will do both. So they might say this idea is good, but let's do the other one.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. Yes. But I think if we talk about like the fundamental question of like the difference between the movie space and the TV space, in the TV space, you're really making a widget, right? It's a pretty cool widget, but it's a widget that has to fit into the widget maker's, the widget buyer's brain.
That's right.
If you're making a feature, especially you started out talking about this sort of wide range or potential wide range, I guess, of like foreign films versus American, US films, right? That's much more malleable than, you can't make a TV show that nobody wants to see the second episode of. Can't make a TV show that nobody wants to see the 5th episode or the 10th episode, or that there isn't a season finale. Like you're dealing with specific kinds of almost cookie cutter spaces that you have to fill with stuff that doesn't feel cookie cutter.
I'm not sure if I'm following that. To me, the idea that you're a TV rule, like episode 5 can't be too weak or else people will tune out and not come back. I think that's pretty analogous to, if you don't have, I mean, people tend to, for whatever reason, not bail out on feature films. That's actually a question. I wonder the bailout rate, especially these days, if you're watching it at home. If you're in a movie theater, they're committed to the evening almost. Although my wife wasn't.
Your money.
I learned that from my wife. She no qualms at all about going 10 minutes in, I'm bored. Let's just beat it.
I've walked out of a movie in my time too, so I've done that once or twice.
Oh, well, no, my wife would do it like once or twice a year. I mean, she just, it's almost like she barely stops. She doesn't even sit down. It's like this now. Anyway, so, but at home, certainly that rate is huge, right? Because people are like, oh, I'll give this movie 10 minutes or whatever.
Right.
It's different, of course, with a series because it's, 10 episodes or 12 or 20 or whatever, or maybe multiple seasons, whereas a feature is 90 minutes or so. So,
Right.
But I think getting to your point, underneath that, as storytellers, we're trying to hold their attention from bell to bell the whole darn time. So if we have a week episode 5, that to me is more analogous, more similar than different than if we've got an Act 2B problem in a feature where we get to minute number 60 or something, and it's not quite as compelling as it could be, to my mind as a writer. But it sounds like you kind of feel like there's a difference.
Well, I feel like at least in the writer's room, the mechanics of it are so, if it's a show with commercials, we're arguing about like, is this the best act break, or is this the best act break, or and if you're working on a TV series that has 6 acts and 10 episodes, then you're coming up with 60 act breaks with a group of people every week about all over the season about like which so it's not that I love the whole television writing process, and yet I really feel the walls of the box, and I really feel like people who sort of want to fit themselves into that space also need to feel the walls of the box. They need to know how that box works and how they can get that box to work if it's a network show, 22 episodes a season. I mean, it's a heavy lift, and I think it's a different kind of stretch.
I have a question for you as a creator of episodes. I mean, I've written one sort of TV show idea, maybe messed around with a couple others. But for you, who's done it, professionally and much more often, and how do you think about length and amount of acts? And at what point in the process do you think about that?
Well, that's another one of those sort of funny questions, only because it's one of those things that's dictated to you depending on what network you're on, right? So we're, Stargirl, and I think I've got this right, the CW shows have 6 acts. So we're doing 6 acts, and when I was on Covert Affairs, I think we might have had 5 acts. And then on, God Friended Me, it was something different. And then, I just wrote on a show that was streaming, and it was just one long blah, blah, blah. So it's really like the tradition of whoever runs that network.
But so that's not so much my question, because you were getting hired to join that machine, right? And then then of course you have to be part of that machine. Yeah. What I'm asking is, when you create new shows, and you're like, what appeals to me? How am I going to do this? What's been your personal process in terms of informing how length, even a very basic length from like a 30-minute-ish to 60-minute-ish show? How do you?
Yeah. So again, this is I love this question because it's related to the whole thing that we started with. Because to me, in the same way that television, under the hood of television is different from under the hood of a feature, under the hood of an hour drama, and under the hood of a 30-minute comedy or dramedy or whatever you want to call it, is also different under the hood. So if I'm creating something, I mean, part of the challenge, and it may be different. It may be different if you're J.J. Abrams or some famous person where you can sort of invent or reinvent the wheel. But for somebody like me, I'm inventing something that, even if I'm not handing it to a network executive the minute I'm done, I am likely handing it to a writer friend I know who's been on a show, or my manager who knows shows, or my agent who knows shows. And they're going to say to me, you've got an hour drama that has 2 acts. Like, that's not, where are you going to sell that? Who's going to read this? Right. And so And so again, like what I tend to do is I tend to sort of formulate something that looks like shows I've been on,
Mhm.
not because, just because it's like, I'm familiar with this. I've been writing 6 acts all season. Let me
Yeah,
write a thing that has 6 acts. Or I wrote this streaming show. I was on the streaming show. Let me write something that feels a little bit like that.
yeah. That's interesting because I mean, in some ways it sounds very similar to one of the sort of the best turning points I made in my career is this idea of really uh, starting with another movie's structure and then just ripping it off. The script I sold last summer, it was very similar in a lot of ways to Kramer versus Kramer, that movie with Dustin Hoffman in 1980, which is about basically this. Yeah, yeah. And it actually holds up really nicely. If you happen to like it, then
Yeah.
you probably
I've seen parts of it since. Yeah.
It crackles to me, and they're really good. And but the structure of it was really interesting to me, and I completely took the structure of it for this screenplay that I just sold. And but nobody would know it. Nobody looks at that thing, goes, oh, but literally there's a lot of beats in there that I just looked at what they did with Kramer versus Kramer,
Like,
and
I'll do that.
I did, yeah. And but I mean, but the reason why people don't see it and it's not plagiarism is because, there's, none of the characters, none of the settings, nothing. I mean, my Kramer versus Kramer was New York City, 1980, advertising executive dealing with, his son and his wife. My screenplay is about a bare knuckle brawler who travels around in 1920s with this circus,
Right.
and this kid winds up on his lap, and both stories are about the father learning to put the son's needs ahead of his own.
Yeah.
So
script.
What's that?
It's a terrific script.
Thank you. So and to the point where I'm writing this new one right now, and I was looking for a format, and so I went and I was like, oh, I really like what Dead Poets Society is doing here. So I was getting notes, I was getting feedback from people, and I kept, because I looked at the rhythms and the beats and I studied Dead Poets Society really carefully, and I just kind of did my version of that. So I'm not reinventing the wheel there. And I was telling the people, I go, look, this is my, Dead Poets Society is set in this, this prep school in like New England, about this, crazy mentor that comes in and riles the kids up for good and for bad reasons. My story is set in Ohio about this 8th grader who joins this. He's new to this community, joins this soccer team, and an influential coach comes in and challenges him. And the theme is about competitiveness and how much winning actually matter. So thematically, it's related but different. Setting totally different. But to me, what powers that underneath the hood, they're so similar,
yeah.
and by design. So when I was getting feedback from people, I was like, oh, I'm going to see, I want to find people who like Dead Poets Society so that they can go, well, you know what, I like yours, but Dead Poets Society did it better. So can you try to make it? And that's very helpful for me as a writer. So I was telling them, and I was looking for people that like that movie. And then I was getting these notes back, and people that loved it were like, oh yeah, it's great, but it's got nothing to do with Dead Poets Society. And then people that didn't like it said the same thing. Like, yeah, it wasn't for me. And I wish it was like Dead Poets Society. Yeah. And I was like, oh, they're relating at a different level, right? We're mechanics right under the hood. They're thinking of setting and character and dialogue and all that stuff. So it was, that was a real revelation for me.
Yeah, I think, I love the scientificness of your process, I just have to say. And I think that there's something really great about the kind of, that sort of reconstitution of this kind of structure that we know works. I mean, we did a version of that, not exactly, but, and I've been on shows where, as a general swath, we've been asked to watch a handful of movies or a handful of TV shows, and there's some version of the DNA of that, whatever it is that the showrunner wants to invest in our show. At the same time, though, one of the things that's really fascinating is, the world of TV is so fast. So we don't have the time to do like a slavish copy of a Like we just don't. We're sort of like, okay, we know these things. We know it's sort of related to this movie. We know it's sort of blah, blah, blah. And we know that our superhero is trying to get blah, blah, blah before the such and such. And then we just are servicing what are those elements that need to happen between, the first moment and the last moment. And then we're off to the races.
Yeah, that sounds pretty similar. I mean, it's at least I wouldn't call my process slavish.
Yes. Well,
I mean, to me, it's you comparing apples to apples. That concept, especially with the people that I mentor, it's really helpful. I have this one client that I've been working with, and she's really brilliant and just, I mean, really amazing with mythology, but she was newer to the deeper value of hero goal conflict, right? And I think partly she was able to enchant people with these really amazing magical mythological choices, and it was missing an opportunity for her to share what happened through changes of the character on a deeper level, right? So it was fascinating to me to kind of break it down and go, okay, well, why do I think that's really important? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, these other things are. And then, and as I was like, okay, well, now I think I know what I'm doing. But in that process, we would just compare like comparables. Like, okay, she's trying to do something that's fairly similar to this. How are they solving that problem? And then when you look at apples to apples like that, you can go, well, their protagonist is very active, has a very urgent goal.
Sure.
Here's the conflict, and here's why that's working. You know what I mean? But without that comparable, it's too much. So to me, whether you're talking about the size of the container that there's a sequence in, or just the dynamics of something, it's like if I have a comparable or a box, that gives me a place to sort of do my thing.
Yeah.
If it's too open, it's like I don't know how to track what I'm doing.
No, I totally agree with that. And I think that the notion of having the comparable always feels a little different to me, at least the way you described it feels a little different to me in the world of television, because if I'm making my television show based on somebody else's television show, then I've got 500 episodes of that television show. So which episode am I using? Am I focusing on in terms of, am I looking at the pilot? Am I looking at season 3, episode 25? Am I looking, like, what am I looking at? And so it becomes, I mean, we in my process, we certainly focus on structure, but then it becomes about what elements are we putting into that structure, and then some other things sort of drop into place, because we're really talking about act breaks and making it from the first episode, the first moment to the last moment, and how we are talking about those moment to moment things in terms of how do we know that there's change, and how do we see the change, and what are the active things, and how can we show and not tell, and and yet it feels like if one of the models is X or Y television show, it's like we've got a ton to choose from. So how do we zero in? How do we
Yeah,
specify?
but to me, what's great about that, I would think would be particularly helpful for when you're talking with teammates, right? In feature film, there's teammates, but not quite as active and as team-like, I think, in the writer's room. But what's great about that is now you have a common reference, right?
Yeah.
So, we can say, okay, we want the tone to be more like X. And then you go, oh, I thought X would actually be this way. And you go, no, I thought X. But now you mean, then again, you can go apples to apples. I think a lot of problems come up. I've written 5 scripts with co-writers. And once you can kind of get on this, and a lot of problems is comparing apples to oranges. You know what I mean? I like something because of this, they like that, but once you get the same fruit, then you can go, okay, right, that makes sense. And then sometimes you still disagree, but
yeah. I mean, this is the thing. Actually, just before we move, transition to whatever, this is the thing that I find, and is the reason I find this question so interesting about the differences, because quite often I've worked with clients who are, they say we're building a comedy along, and I say to them, well, what's the model for the comedy?
Yeah.
And they'll name 5 shows, maybe only one of them is a comedy, one of them is a drama, one of them, and I'm like, whoa, and so I partly do believe that there is that thing where where people aren't necessarily thinking about what's under the hood. They're sort of thinking about like what, the character might remind them of something in a drama, or the flavor or the tone, it might be, but in terms of making that thing, if it's going to look like a 30-minute, it's going to look like a comedy that's on network, for example, it's going to be 30 minutes. It's going to have a certain number of act breaks. It's going to have a certain number of characters. It's going to have a certain number of sets. Like, that's what you're building. That's what you're telling me you're building. And if you really want it to look like such and such, that's a drama, it's a completely different beast.
Yeah, that comes up a lot in the feature world when you're talking about like a cross, if you're pitching something.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, sometimes I see newer writers make this mistake a lot. They'll say, "Oh, I got this idea, and it's like this meets that, and it's like, whoa, that's too much." Usually the best crosses are at maximum 2, but even when you get to 2, you kind of have to distinguish which element of one of them. You know what I mean? So you might say, "Oh, it's like." I was actually thinking of the thing I'm writing now. I was thinking of it in terms of, first, like, again, I was thinking of it as Dead Poet Society, but there's a bit of just a touch of mawkishness or saccharine sort of quality to that. And I prefer much more grounded material. So I was thinking of it as like Dead Poet Society meets Kids, that sort of Larry Clark documentary-esque fiction movie set in the 90s. So I like that edge. To me, tonally, so that it was like the structure and everything from Dead Poet Society, but it was like the tone and the groundedness and the edge from Kids. But again, then I told people were like, "Hey, your script is nothing like either one of those." Yeah. And then at least I script out I go, okay, well, Kids was completely throwing people off. So I said, well, it's going to be kind of like Whiplash and Dead Poet Society, because Whiplash was, to me, more grounded and had the intensity that I'm drawn to. But even that's when it was kind of like, well, I thought the coach was going to be much harsher because you whiplash the guy. And I was like, and again, so I was like, so the next time I go out with that, I'm just going to be, look, it's a grounded sports film. But you get into this idea, and crosses can be really good, but like the best ones are more very simple, like, Jaws in space, right? Okay, yeah, it's a monster movie in space. That's Alien, right? When you kind of take something and then you just riff on like the setting, that's an easy one, or the time period maybe. That makes it, because what you want to do is get clarity. And believe me, I've seen some people, they put 3, 4, 5 different movies, and it's like, man, you just, because we have different associations of what the most significant elements were.
Right.
So start wrapping up for today.
Yeah, I mean, this is good. I was just thinking though, like, I do feel like there's a, and I love the facility of, Jaws in space, or even what you were talking about with Dead Poet Society and, and Kids. And, I don't believe that I sort of enter the space with, I mean, obviously I have some reference, I have some flavor. Sometimes it's a secret. Like I'm not about to give it out, possibly because it's going to confuse people. But I also feel like there's so much television, and I feel like so much of, also I think the playwright in me on some level, once I know who my characters are and what the structure is that I'm going to fill, I don't know that I'm necessarily, I mean, obviously everything's been done on some level, but I don't know that I know like the touchstone is exactly this and the touchstone is exactly that. Like, there are plenty of times when the playwright in me sort of wants to find it. And of course, then once I've found it, then I'm going to sort of shape and change and sharpen, but I don't know that I necessarily go in. And I partially I want to say some of the time that I don't know that the model is out there for some of the stuff that I'm doing, partly because I'm, trying to kind of, stretch the envelope, or whatever the expression is. And that may or may not be true, but it's interesting, again, to kind of hear that comparison space.
Yeah, I have more thoughts on several of those things, but we probably should bring them around maybe to another episode.
Yeah, cool, great.
But yeah, really good conversation today. I appreciate anybody who's listened to this.
Yeah, it's great. It's really fun. And yeah, if you have thoughts, definitely let us know what those thoughts are. And it's been really fun to do this.
Yeah, really great.
Yeah, cool.